Sure.
Hey everybody. I'm just looking through the screens and seeing some folks I know, some that I don't know. It's great that you're all here with us. Thank you for coming. So on behalf of Oakland Summer School, I want to welcome Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. If you're excited to be here in this Zoom space with them, do you want to just show some kind of like jazz hands or hearts or waves or whatever you got, any kind of love? Yeah, oh yeah, the reactions, that's great too. Whatever you have, people. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here. So it's a great honor to be in this space, in this moment with everyone who's assembled. My name is Chika Okoye, and I will give us a brief introduction to this time, and then I'll pass it to my co-moderator, Conde, before we get into some discussion with Stefano.
Very influential on me. And Fred Moten is the guy who his classes I was auditing at NYU.
Oh, somebody else's audio right now. Not me right now. Do you mind just muting your audio? And thank you in advance for bearing with all the funny things that can happen in these kinds of gatherings. So just to get us started, we're going to have this conversation today for close to 90 minutes. On the West Coast, we'll be wrapping up about 1:30, that's Pacific time. So we'll do some quick introductions here, and then myself and Akande will ask questions that Fred and Stefano will respond to. After that, we'll have a moment of breaking out into small groups. So we'll spend around 15 minutes in small groups with each other. It'll be randomized, maybe 4 or 5 people per group. And in that time, folks can get together, introduce themselves and figure out some questions you may want to ask to our 2 guests today. And we'll have a Google document that you can enter some questions into. And following that period, we'll get back together as a large group and we'll go through some of those questions. Probably we won't get to all of them, but that's how it looks. If you have any technical problems, you'll be able to chat directly to Oakland Summer School. And we have a wonderful volunteer named Michelle who will help you out to the best of her ability. So yeah, so we'll go into it. So let me introduce Akande X, my co-moderator for today. Akande X is a California-based writer and researcher of philosophy and literature. He is a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow who is graduating from University of Southern California with a degree in philosophy. His interests include philosophy of cognitive science, finding alternate forms of higher education, and anarchism. His other interests include hiking and tending to his budding garden. So I'll pass it to you, Akande.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chika. And again, it's an honor to be here with everyone. I'll give Chika's bio and then I'll give Stefano and Fred's bio. So Chika Okoye is an independent scholar who focuses on histories of Black liberation struggles. She co-founded Black Life, a series at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, a monthly live event that showcased the work of Black artists and intellectuals. Chika is the program director of Buddhist Peace Fellowship, a nonprofit that works to enhance the spiritual power of activists and movements working for progressive change. And to give the bios of our guests, we're so happy to have you here. Stefano Harney and Fred Moten are authors of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Autono Media and Minor Compositions in 2013, and the forthcoming All Incomplete, also from Minor Compositions. The Undercommons has been translated into Braille, Spanish, and German, with further translations underway in Thai, Portuguese, Italian, French, Swedish, and Indonesian. Fred teaches in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. Stefano is an independent scholar and holds an honorary professorship at the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Fred is also the author of All That Beauty from Lighter Machine Editions in 2019, Stefano is also author of State Work, Public Administration, and Mass Intellectuality from Duke University Press in 2002. Fred lives in New York City and Stefano lives in Brasilia. They are both members of Le Mardi Gras Listening Collective and the Anti-Colonial Machine and the Institute for Physical Psychology, amongst other collaborative projects. So thank you so much again for being here. I'm so excited. And we'll just roll right into the questions if that's all right. So, from what I understand, this is your first public, talk since the election. So I feel like it's only right that we kind of open with a question on the, whatever you want to call it, what's going on with the election. So, and I was thinking about your "We Want a Precedent" essay that you wrote, and yeah, I guess I'm wondering if anything has changed since you've written that essay, and it doesn't sound like from what Fred said, before we started, that he's not too pleased with people celebrating and all that. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear your general thoughts on the election and the moment we're in politically.
Well, first of all, thank you guys so much for, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for coming and thank you, Akande and Chika, and all the folks who helped Danielle, Oakland Summer School. We're glad to be here with you all today. It's a pleasure. I feel like, life is hard, so, you shouldn't need to have too much of an excuse to have a party, but it was loud, down around here where I live last night. And I wasn't feeling it, like that myself. But it's funny, in a way, almost I feel like, I don't want to say, well, my mind, has changed just since we were talking 5 minutes ago. But yeah, I think that on the one hand, people grab onto whatever little hope they can find, and then I think, it's the job of everybody, to think about the actual, practical, capacity, that is attached to that particular hope. So on the one hand, I don't want to bash anybody's hopes, but on the other hand, we still have to keep doing what we were always, what all of us have done. It's just annoying sometimes, like I get these texts from people saying, "Oh, now we got to get to work." Like, I've been working, or these celebrations. I remember it. I'm 58 years old. I remember similar celebrations when Bill Clinton was elected. After 12 years of Reagan Bush. I remember the Obama. So you just try to not get too low and try to not get too high. So anyway, I'm just blathering. Steve, what do you think?
Well, just before I start, please, if I could also say thank you to Akande, thank you to Chika, thank you to Melissa. Special thanks to my friend Laura Nelson, who first connected us with the Oakland Summer School, and to everybody in the Oakland Summer School Collective. Thank you for having us here, and thanks everybody for being here with us. I see a few friends, other friends in the audience. Thank you. It's good to see your names. We were talking about this actually the other day, and of course the problem, as Fred's hinting, with the formulation, let's get back to work, is that, you know, it can deceive us a little bit because, you know, I think when you hear somebody like Angela Davis, or how you used to hear Howard Zinn telling you to go out and vote and then get back to work, they had a very different idea about work than I think the people who are texting Fred have about work, you know, because part of what we mean when we say, well, we've been working all along here, is that every day when we wake up, you know, everything we do, all of us here, you know, basically just barely keeps this system afloat. Our hardest efforts every day in these institutions, on the streets, you know, essentially every day we wake up and we follow the path of reform. Because if we didn't reform this thing every single day, it would collapse under the weight of its own stupidity, you know, under the weight of its own ugliness. So the problem is that formulation, which is such an easy liberal formulation to make, such a dangerous formulation, in my view, to make, in our view, you know, is exactly what you get each time here. Nobody says to you, you know, amongst the people that we spend time with, nobody says to you, oh, well, things are going to be okay now because, you know, Clinton's been elected, or Obama's been elected, or Jimmy Carter's been elected, right? They say to you, well, that's something, and now we're going to get back to work. Basically saying to you, go work your ass off keeping this fucking thing from falling apart, right? And we'll get back to you in 4 years, and then we'll say it all over to you again, right? So I think it's important for us to say, we're not working in between these 4 years. You know, we're at war, as me and Fred were saying the other day. You know, in between these elections, we're at war. It's not a matter of just doing the work, because the work is reform. And in the old formulation, you know, revolution or reform, we've already proven reform doesn't do shit, because we do it every single day. It's the only reason the universities are still standing. You know, it's the only reason that pretty much all our institutions are still standing, because we every day do enough reform to keep them from collapsing under their own contradictions. So we can't think of ourselves as going back to work. I think we really have to think of ourselves as going back to war, a war that's, of course, been brought onto us, and in which we are largely involved in various forms of, you know, mutual self-defense. So that's why the kind of knowing critique of Democratic Party or electoral politics, I think, can be so frustrating, because it hides a much more malicious idea that our jobs is to keep this shit going. And it's been like that for 400 or 500 years. You know, the thing would not work if every day it wasn't us who was actually stuck in the position of keeping the thing going that we actually want to see destroyed. Right? That's our contradiction, and anticipating some of the other great questions that we've been posed. You know, that's our problem with the university. You know, but that's the problem with pretty much, you know, every institution, every government we face, right? Is, you know, we're in this position every day where we should be, you know, we keep going the thing that we want to destroy. And that's just our position. You know, that's where we are. And we follow in the footsteps of millions who've done that. And so we can't complain, but we also can't deceive ourselves and thinking that going back to work is going to be enough. You know, we're at war, you know, a war that is, I say, been brought to our doorsteps every day. What our friend Manolo Callahan taught us was, you know, a war on our very subsistence, a war on our lives. So I guess that's probably where Fred gets his move. I'm sitting here in Sao Paulo, and, you know, it's 90 degrees and the bars are open. So it's a little different for me at the moment, but I think I can figure Fred's move.
Thank you for those reflections and responses to the current moment. I would like to ask you now about the Undercommons, your book that you wrote together that came out in 2013, and I think does some work to describe these antagonisms that this contradiction that you've just named for us, Stefano. And I wonder what you all were trying to say or figure out in the writing of that book, and how that's the same or how that might be different now in 2020.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that we've, over the last maybe few months especially, having had a lot of opportunities to talk with folks like we are right now, we've had a chance to, reflect on it. And I think, so there's a couple of things. One is, as Stefano says a lot, we were trying to help each other through or to deal with, the contradictions of working in the university. And it was something that we came, I think probably that we had always been concerned with those contradictions and embedded in them in increasingly more conscious ways since we met in college in like 1982, and that we weren't able to maybe fully articulate it as much then, but we were living these conditions under which we were like, well, we want to be here with each other. We want to be, studying with each other. We're interested in things. And why is it that the institution that we came to in order to study together keeps keeping us from doing that? Why does that keep happening? And then there's the question of why it keeps happening, which is sort of adjunct to the actual practice of saying, well, we're going to try to study anyway. We're going to do that anyway. And, we lived through that on a kind of practical level, when we were students together. And then we all, we went to grad school and went separate ways for, in that moment, still maintaining contact with each other. But there was a moment in the late 90s when we were together in New York again and hung out a lot, and we were facing the same problem. But this time we were facing that problem from the perspective of being junior faculty rather than being, students, undergraduate students. And, that was 20 years ago when we began to write together in the face of that problem. And eventually it emerged under the rubric, under between the covers of the Undercommons, some of our questions. But the Undercommons is misleading in a certain kind of way, because I think by the time we published that book, we were, I don't want to say past that problem, but it had not become, but it wasn't anymore our sort of fundamental and abiding concern, how to live or how to survive the contradictions of the university. It was, we had, I think maybe we had kind of pulled ourselves through something, before the Undercommons was published. We had pulled ourselves through something. Maybe what we had pulled ourselves through is just any kind of tendency to flagellate ourselves because of the contradiction. Any tendency to think that our living in that contradiction was a function of some personal moral failure, right? And so, and one way to think about it is that in that book, I think sometimes it maybe seems like in that chapter on the university and the Undercommons that we're trying to valorize a certain individuated figure of the subversive intellectual or the critical intellectual, and trying to maybe give some primer for how one might become that figure. But really, no, it was what has become maybe more clear to us now, and what we want to help make more clear to other people is it was never about the valorization of that figure. It was always about maybe more of a diagnosis of that figure and a recognition of the limits of that figure. And so, that's, and it was the limits of ourselves as individual instances of such a figure that we had, again, come to try to understand and to try to work through. I'll shut up now because I think I know I just went on too long, and I'm sure I didn't even answer the question, but Steve will, my tongue is in my friend's mouth, so.
Well, that's exactly how I would say it. But the only other thing I would add is that, one of the things we realize, and which I'm sure you realize, and if you've been through graduate school, or you're going to graduate school, or thinking about going to graduate school, in it right now, etc., gradually you get more and more isolated. But not only that, the method of thought turns you, even against your own subject matter, towards spending so much more time critiquing the shit that you hate than exploring and experimenting with the stuff that you love. And that's the other thing that we realized was going on in the undercommons. That in order to get to that stuff that we loved, we had to stop getting individuated into this model of a certain kind of intellectual, and it turns out that meant also getting out of the individual as a figure itself, and even more than that, in order really to start to be with the stuff that we love, in order really to spend our time with all of the beautiful insurgent experiments that were the reason that we got interested in things in the first point. It wasn't just that we almost couldn't do it by ourselves, but even in the course of the undercommons, and then subsequently, and this I think is coming through in the new book, All Incomplete, even the two of us was not enough. Even blurring ourselves together, was a hell of a lot better, but it wasn't enough. And so you notice in our bio that we're telling people more that we're working with other people more. And that's not just a function of saying, okay, well, we've experimented with a certain kind of undoing between ourselves. Let's do that with them. It's direct function of saying, we need to be with other people to love this stuff, because this stuff that we love is collective. This stuff that we love is cooperative. This stuff that we love is shared, and can't be retained or owned, in any proper manner. It has to be constantly re-socialized against the forces, like critique, like citation, that would individualize it again. So our pleasure to be working with CCCR, with the Madigar Listening Collective, with Anti-Colonial Machine. These are pleasures of being able to get back to what we love, what we got brought up loving, in families and in communities, which we lost somewhere along the way, through a professional education. But fortunately, we didn't lose it completely. So all that was sort of going on in the undercommons too, I think.
Yeah, because I always felt like it was a misreading, for certain academics and thinkers to say that, they feel comfortable in the undercommons, or the undercommons is a space that, or being a critical academic is, again, something to be, celebrated. And while, it is good to be critical rather than, like passive, I never really agree with that idea that, it's good to be there. Which kind of leads me to my next question. And that's on your recent essay, The University Last Words. Because to me, it seemed like that was like a complete shift in tone from that essay in the undercommons, the university. It was just very, like, I don't know, for lack of better words, angry. And it just seemed like you were just done with the university. And I don't know. I guess like, my question is, with that sort of tone in the university last where it's like, when's the moment that the critical academic leaves the university or even like tries to abolish or like starts open planning against the university?
Well, again, well, it's one of the reasons why I keep wanting to say it's good to be in Oakland, even though I'm not in Oakland, but it's good to be virtually in Oakland. We were talking about, I can't remember which Zoom it was over the last 2 or 3 days. At some point we were talking about Cedric Robinson, who we're always talking about and always trying to talk with, and he's from Oakland, and we were, and I guess one of the lessons, one of the 4,000 universities that I appear to have worked for was University of California, Santa Barbara. And my office for the couple of years that I was there was directly above his office, 1 floor above. And his door was open, to students and to, and the younger faculty. And he allowed me to believe that I could claim to be his student, in a way that was very loving and gracious. And we, I think we both, feel that way. So the point is, I used to listen to him talk a lot. And one of the things that kind of recurring motif in conversations with him, he liked to talk about the fact that he imagined that the contradictions of capitalism, were becoming so onerous and so profound and so heavy that the system would collapse under its weight. And in this way, as he wrote a book called Black Marxism, which was a critique of a certain kind of Marxian thinking from the perspective of what he calls the Black radical tradition. But it was also very evident and clear that there were aspects and elements of Marx's work that he was absolutely committed to, always, okay? And one of them would be maybe a certain kind of historicism that was predicated on the notion that at a certain point, the contradictions would become too great. And so he would say, we have to heighten the contradictions, But I think maybe we're beginning to recognize that now. It's very interesting. It's important to recognize that the contradictions of capitalism are also contradictions that we live with and through. That we can't be unscathed by those contradictions. At the same time as we want to heighten those contradictions and intensify those contradictions from an antagonistic sort of perspective, we can't blind ourselves to the fact that in that very process, in that very work, the contradictions also impose themselves upon us in profound ways. Which is just a long-winded way to preface the simple answer to the question, Akane, which is like, on the one hand, there's a sense in which we must say that the critical intellectual, the subversive intellectual doesn't leave the university. That is, in a certain sense, the natural habitat of the critical and subversive intellectual. And to say that isn't to disavow that figure. What's also important to see, it seems to me, is that, I got a job. I'm glad to have a job. I need a job. Okay. Like I have to work, sorry, I'm glad. They had a really great conference in honor of Cedric when he was about to retire from UCSB. And he insisted at this conference that the night before the proceedings started officially, Everybody get together and watch Devil in a Blue Dress, right? The Carl Franklin film of the Walter Mosley novel. And there's a moment at the end of that film where, Easy Rollins, played by Denzel Washington, and his friend Deacon Odell, who's played by oh man, I can't think, Albert. Is it Albert Hall? At one point, Easy has basically said to himself that he's going to set up shop as a private investigator. So Albert Hall, he says, how you going to get a job? And at one point, Denzel said, I ain't studying no job. And Odell said, you ain't studying no job. How you going to live? Okay. So, but we're not private eyes. I personally don't have no other skills. This is the skill that I got. So I need the job, okay? And that places me, and us, squarely in the contradiction. I mean, Stefano's been living without a damn job for 2 years, and this shit is not fun, So I'm gonna keep working in the university for 2 reasons. Same reasons that I think General Baker kept working at Dodge and Ford Motor Company, even though he was an organizer for the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Because the workers are there. The students are there. I want to be in the university because the students are there, but also because I need to make a living. Now, what that means is these contradictions are contradictions that I have to live every day and live through every day and be scarred by every day, at the same time that we're also trying to heighten these contradictions and deepen these contradictions every day. So it's really not about leaving the university as much as it's about trying to implode the motherfucker from inside of it. And that ends up sounding very uncomfortably like a set of variations on justifications for reform. I know that. That's why that stuff that Stefano was talking about reform, or it's very much like some of the formulations now that maybe, Joy James makes in these kind of brilliant ways about the figure of the captive maternal, which we could say more about. But yeah, I don't know what to say, We're just working. We're trying to work under conditions of war, which are under conditions of contradiction. I'm not trying to be pure. We can't be pure. I'm not trying to hold anybody else up to that shit because I can't hold myself up to it, Anyway, I'm putting myself on mute now for 10 minutes.
I want to jump in and say something that really moved me that you shared, Fred, in a recent talk that you and Stefano did. I think it was with the UC Irvine students. We said that enslaved people were not worried about their complicity with the plantation, something like that. And I feel some echoes of what you've just shared in that kind of a formulation. I think it's useful, that we are scarred by this war, and we got to keep living it. I don't know if Stefano, you wanted to add anything, or yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, one of the things that Fred and I have been talking about recently a lot together is these kinds of questions of class that emerge in post-colonial nations. Partly because we just had the benefit of being in conversation with so many people who have direct experience with post-colonial nations. It's been one of the expansions in the way we've been able to talk. Because of course, here in the United States, we're still basically in the midst of the longest anti-colonial movement in history. Which is what the Black struggle is. It's what the indigenous struggle is in this country. And it ain't over, But of course, a whole bunch of other things get thrown up in these other contexts. So what I kind of wanted to add, Chica, is that there is, of course, this question of our complicity. And we've spoken about ways in which we can move this complicity towards, we use the Italian term complicità to talk about developing accomplices, unseen accomplices within this institutional complicity, such that complicity begins to shift and it becomes a bigger problem for the institution than it does for you. Because now the institution is saying, I feel like it's not just her in the room today. I feel like there's some kind of plot going on here. I feel like there is some kind of conspiracy in the way that this person does not arrive as a proper individual, who then can start to worry about the individual problem of complicity and how one strategizes as an individual between compromise and sellout and your practice and your revolution. Instead, this sense of complicità allows us to start to think that it was a mistake for them to let us become complicit in this institution, because us is us, not me, not I. But we've also been thinking and talking about how we still need to make a distinction between complicity and betrayal. And the person who has really helped us to think about this is a great Guyanese feminist intellectual activist called Ndaya, whose work just came out posthumously and is appropriately titled "The Point is to Change the World." And Ndaya was a comrade of Walter Rodney, but she was also someone who took a certain kind of distance from this comrade whom she loved in order to do all kinds of independent feminist organizing within the left in Guyana and within the left in the Caribbean in general. There's a lot to say about her. And once this book gets out more, I think we'll all be talking about her. And of course, she's well known in the Caribbean already, the English-speaking Caribbean in particular, for her absolutely uncompromising critique, which was, she always remained completely inside this revolutionary left, while also being a critic of it. But she has a great essay where she talks about the work of George Lamming, the great Barbadian novelist. And she says, look, the key theme in all of Lamming's work, his speeches from the 80s, as well as his novels from before, his work afterwards as a teacher, etc., they all hinge around this question of betrayal. And what kind of betrayal is this? And she's very clear. She says, this is the betrayal of someone who's come out of the people. We're not talking about the imperialist betrayal. We're not talking about the plantocracy's betrayal. We know, we can expect, that to happen. What we're talking about is the betrayal that occurs largely through the mobility that comes from education in the colonial and then post-colonial nation, largely through the phenomenon of being sent from Trinidad to Oxford, from Lagos to Oxford, etc. Right? And all of Lamming's work is around this post-colonial problem of betrayal, how it's not just a matter of the middle classes who C.L.R. James had warned us for years shouldn't be allowed to take over in an independent period, but it is the way in which the middle classes and the larger imperial system pulls out through education people from the working classes, from the ordinary African and Indian working classes and poor, and gives them this opportunity, and then creates a condition in which betrayal becomes all too easy. And in Lamming's famous novel, The Village, one of their own from the village ends up selling the land on which the village is standing. Right. So I say all that, Chika, to say that there's all this work all the time to do between the complicity that we have amongst the complicity we have amongst the need we have to work and not get sucked into an individual strategy with how we feel good about work, And nonetheless, also with these questions of betrayal, you know, and I say that, of course, because we just had an election, so we're about to see a really great example of it, you know, and that's where we, you know, that's the terrain on which we're working, and it is intense. You know, I'm sure it's intense for all of you, if it's intense for me.
And it's important to think too that I think that this notion of betrayal it's a structural formulation that really ought not be indexed to this or that person's individual moral failing. It's really not a matter of personal responsibility. Another way to put it would be that part of the betrayal is already given in believing in and acceding to the metaphysics of personal responsibility. And you can see that, you know, within the class composition of the critique of the one who betrays, okay, can take a double form, right? There's a working class critique of the middle class one who betrays, okay? And we want to say that working class critique is grounded maybe in certain forms of, in certain kinds of empirical life that we would want to honor and pay attention to. But we also recognize, and it's a powerful sort of actually quite vicious and much more prevalent discourse, is the discourse in which the middle class so-called intellectual constantly understands working class people as themselves being engaged in betrayal, right? But those forms of betrayal take the form of selling drugs or doing shit you ain't supposed to do, or you're constantly flirting with non-respectability, right? That's a discourse of betrayal. And these are both discourses of individual moral agency that on the one hand, okay, refuse the forms of radical complicity that we would actually have to constantly be renewing. Okay? And on the other hand, never take into account the forms of problematic complicity, okay, that again, we would talk about under a general framework of betrayal that could be enacted from any position within the shit, okay? And so I guess, you know, it's important. That's what there's a kind of everyday practice that we have to, of complicity that we have to engage in, of collaboration that we have to engage in. I mean, I was thinking about this morning, talking with Laura here. I mean, collaboration on a purely, the etymology of collaboration simply means working with. But there's an interpretation of working with that then amends to working with the phrase one another. But the imposition of that phrase one another implies a structure of individuation and separation, okay? Of individuation in relation that fucks up the force and the radical force and power of collaboration. Okay, and I was reminded of this by my primary, you know, by the one. See, this is the thing. I was reminded of this by the one with whom I am constantly collaborating. But what I was reminded of is that very formulation of collaboration is already a betrayal. And it already produces all kinds of difficulties for the collaboration within which we are supposed to practice. Okay. And what it means is not only that we have to refrain from the ways in which critique can so easily devolve into a kind of nasty meanness that anybody might exhibit toward anyone else's impurity, right? And I know y'all know about that. But we also have to refrain from this sense that well, we have to refrain from the notion that somehow there's an individual transcendence of the institutions within which we are supposed to practice complicity, and that individual transcendence is primarily a function of some kind of new theoretical advance. There is no theoretical resolution to the contradictions of the metaphysics of individuation. Ain't no theoretical position that is adequate that will allow us to escape that shit. Okay. The way we escape the metaphysics of individuation is in collaborative practice.
Wow, that's so much that you just offered there. Thank you for those reflections. I'm gonna try to formulate. So I guess I'll move on to this question that I had, and I'm not sure if it's a good segue or not, but I want to try to make sure to get it in, about the way that the two of you write, you know, in a lot of different places about how it is that, or that it is that, oh my, let me consult my notes. I'm getting lost. Okay, right. So thinking a little bit about Blackness and what you all describe as racial difference, or the internal difference. You guys talk about the way that racial difference brings regulation into being, or law into being. And another way that I've heard you say this is that resistance is primary. And I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more about this notion, and maybe if you want to talk also about Blackness and how you think about Blackness. Yeah, and what we shared with you earlier, I quoted from what you guys had written after Michael Brown was killed, that Blackness names or stands in for life itself, Earth itself. So I'm trying to combine a couple questions here, and do what you want with it, please.
Well, thank you. Maybe I can start, and then Fred, if you want to jump in at some point on this, because it's a lot. But the first thing to say about it is that this is really a way of a practice of thinking that we are really doing collectively, with a whole bunch of other Black Studies scholars, with a whole bunch of people in community, etc. So this is really not something that, you know, Stefano and Fred are producing. Closer to the fact would be that we're being produced by it. So just to say that. So that's the first thing. To part of the specific part of your question, you probably know that there's the phrase from Deleuze about resistance being prior, which in turn informs a whole political tradition in Italy around the priority of workers over capital, which is a revision of Marxism. But we also know, in the case of both traditions, that, you know, Deleuze was aware of people like George Jackson, of the Panthers, of Black movements in general. We know that there was all kinds of social intercourse between the Italian left and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and so when we talk about resistance being prior, in particular when we talk about Blackness being prior, we have all that in mind, but we're also moving back through a long history in which you can watch the vicious ways in which regulation kicks in the face of collective self-organization amongst the damned of the earth. And so when you read history, the pattern appears always clear, that what comes first is mutual aid, self-organization, a return to some way of living with and in the earth, and a rejection of this worlding that comes with European thought, and then a brutal interdiction to try to prevent these experiments. And that's not to in any way romanticize what is the day-to-day life of what Fanon called the damned of the earth, but rather to reverse certain assumptions about where life-giving power really resides. So that's it's almost like a device for us when we're approaching things, to be able to say to ourselves, okay, well, if this shit is like this right now, what was going on? Right? What was going on? So when we visit, because friends let us visit places like a village in Mexico that's experiencing some forms of brutality. You know, of course, one wants to critique the brutality. One wants to get them out. But also, you want to know, well, why'd they have to do this? Because there was something going on. There was something going on that they couldn't abide and keep their vicious system of accumulation and exploitation in place. And then the final thing to say is, and maybe Fred Fred should do whatever, but we again should return to Cedric Robinson here, because it's Robinson who teaches us in his Anthropology of Marxism book about the ways in which there is a battle inside Europe between a kind of medieval socialism that is emerging really in large part from the fact that Europe is coming out of its isolation and its sort of vicious, one set of vicious internecine wars. Between that kind of nascent socialism, which we find, Silvia Federici and others also help us to find this, which we find in communities of women, amongst monks, amidst communities of foresters, et cetera, and the emergence of state formation, what Foucault is going to call those race wars, which need to consolidate these populations and are going to use essentially these categories of race, which are coterminous in their origin with the emergence of something like the human, right? So conterminous with all that stuff. And they're going to use that as a way to exploit whole populations, divide whole populations, capture whole populations, etc. And he talks a lot about Ireland in this regard, just like Marx and Engels does, right? And so one of the things that, and this is also a place where we always need to reference our friend and teacher Denise Ferreira da Silva, who tells us about it, how the emergence of philosophy from the 1600s is also going to reinforce this by emphasizing the self-determination of this emerging individual against the affectability of those who are being racialized, of those who are being prepared for a new sexual division of labor, for a new forms of patriarchy, etc. The affectable, the slave, the servant, the foreigner, who can't possibly ever become sovereign, then gets grouped and racialized. And that's what, finally, that's the civilization, that European civilization is the one that arrives in Africa. And again, Robinson says, this is the tragedy. You have the meeting of an inferior civilization and a superior civilization at this exact moment, with the resulting, horror that we see. And of course, by inferior civilization, he's talking about the Europeans, right? So what's interesting in all that is that you can say that Blackness is there before it gets firmly attached to Black people, which it's then going to do, of course, right? And even still, we might want to say that although Black people bear the unbearable burden of that Blackness as it is perceived by power, it's not necessarily coterminous with them, because we can see that that's the case historically. And so some of what we're trying to do is to mobilize Blackness as a way to name the mutual experiments, the shared experiments in giving life in the face of a death-dealing system that emerges at that time, in which we live in heightened contradictions today. I'll stop there.
Part of what, just to add one little bit, I mean, that we live the brutal history of the racialization, what Fanon will call the epidermalization, okay, of these beautiful radical experiments that Stefano is describing. The epidermalization and racialization of the alternative. And that epidermalization and racialization firmly attached the beautiful experiment to Black people. And we have come to know the beautiful experiment now as Blackness. And we can't turn our backs on that history. We can't go back before that history, which is why we have to take into account the necessity of a distinction between Blackness and the people who are called Black, the people who are racialized and epidermalized as Black, at the same time as we have to constantly recognize that the people who are epidermalized and racialized as Black have a privileged, but we could also similarly say an underprivileged relation to Blackness. These things are true. And then there's much more to be said about, by way of both Denise De Silva, but also Hortense Spillers, about the irreducible gendering of Blackness, right? The intensity with which Blackness then also gets associated with an impossible maternity, right? That is both as a matter of choice and as a matter of imposition, is socialized all throughout the Black social field. These are, but there's we can never detach Blackness from Black people. And we know that on the one hand, it's not arbitrary where it is that we go to look for Blackness, right? We know where we have to go to look for it. And at the same time, we'd be looking for it everywhere. Okay. But partly because the repression of it is ubiquitous, right? But it lets us know that we have to look for it everywhere. Okay. She's like, we know the best places to look. We know the most likely places to look, but we look for it everywhere. Okay. And that means we also have to understand, the general ubiquity of anti-Blackness. Okay. And maybe this is a place where, like Stefano says, well, there's no question of anybody doing this work by themselves or in pairs, or it's a general project. Okay. And maybe the easiest way to put it, the best way to put it is that there's antagonisms within the general project. But those antagonisms are ours to share.
Wow, that is absolutely brilliant. And Chica and I were talking about Blackness, and while we were reading your work, and we were just curious, like, what are the limits, or what are the bounds of Blackness? Because Blackness seems to permeate through so many histories and cultures and politics in your work. Like, I'm curious, like, if we could, like, and I don't know if I'm framing this question in like the right way, if we could like stand at the bounds of Blackness or see the bounds of Blackness, like what would that be? Or what are the bounds of Blackness? If that makes sense.
Well, I'll say something now and be brief so Stefano can pick it up. But you know, maybe to slightly shift the question just a bit, that it's not, I can't say, I don't know. I don't know not only how one would determine the bounds or the limits of Blackness, but also whether or not, you know, I mean, another person that we've learned from a lot, you know, is Nahum Chandler. And I've you know, we've been influenced and convinced by the way in which he thinks about Blackness as what he calls the illimitable. I mean, man, you know, there's all kinds of freaky, cool, technical questions one could get into if you're sort of pseudo-philosophically minded, you know, like some of us are, you know. It would allow us to think through what the relationship might be between, say, boundedness that is at the same time illimitable in the ways in which its constant and rich internal differentiation can't be stopped or placed under limit. Even if it's placed under repression, even if it's placed under the most brutal forms of bounded carcerality, right? Even if those forms of bounded carcerality, those forms of bounded carcerality, in a way, almost are reflective of another modality of boundedness that strangely operates as if it were an open field. Okay, and so maybe the other way I would put it then would be something like, man, I'm less interested in the question of the boundaries of Blackness than I am in the question of what it means to be bound to Blackness. And then on another level, what it is to be bound for Blackness, what it is to be on the way to Blackness. How it is that Blackness could be a thing that you could be both on the way to and be bound to and bound within, you know? But these are questions which basically place us not against the limits of Blackness, but against the limits of metaphysics, okay? Which came to fuck up Blackness, but keeps losing, you know? And it's just a really bad loser, okay? And it's a bad loser that produces very, very vicious material effects, you know? And again, I'm really not trying to be a smart, I mean, I'm really not trying to be all cute, you know? I'm saying, man, that in a lot of ways, this whole problematic of Blackness is as it were, on the one hand, you could say that it's the platform or the conceptual scheme from which we then could begin to say something intelligent about boundaries, about limits, about the problem of the whole, about parts versus wholes, right? About that general condition of thought which tries to see the world as a whole, which Bertrand Russell calls that general condition metaphysics. Blackness is the conceptual scheme, we could say, from which we can then begin to think metaphysics or critique metaphysics. It's just that that's a fucking metaphysical formulation. And it's a it places Blackness right back into the framework of what the old Berkeley philosophy professor Donald Davidson would have called the very idea of a conceptual scheme. Okay, so it's a conundrum, it's a dilemma that you raise, and it's very connected to the reason why before we were saying it. This ain't a matter of formulating the proper theoretical position or trying to imagine Blackness as the proper, sort of ground of that proper philosophical subjective position. What's at stake is a way more radical and way more fundamental apocalypse. And it's part of the reason why you could get a whole bunch of people in the room who have a bunch of different varying formulations about Blackness and anti-Blackness, for that matter. You have Jared's section over here, and Tiffany Lethabo King over here, and Catherine McKittrick over there, and Frank Wilderson over here, and Robin Kelly, and R.A. Judy, and and they might disagree on a whole bunch of shit, but the one thing they would agree with is that Blackness has something to do with the end of the world, which is to say, with the end of the metaphysical project of worlding that Stefano was talking about, which and how we live it, okay, under the political economic regime of virulent, fucking coloniality. Okay. Blackness is the end of that shit, okay? So it's what the illimitability of Blackness is hopefully to be mobilized in the interest of the limitation of that, right? Okay. Of putting that shit, as it were, in its place.
Okay, I'm gonna bust in here. I want to say thank you so much for everything that you're sharing. We're a little over our time that we had originally planned, which always happens. But I wonder if Stefano and Fred, if y'all are able to stay like another 10-ish minutes than what we had said, maybe we could still get people into small groups for a shorter time to just talk with each other about their reactions and then come up with a couple more questions for y'all. That works? Okay, thank you so much. So I think
That's fine.
Okay, cool. So I think breakout rooms, we're going to move into a breakout room session so folks can get together with possibly some new people to talk about some of these ideas. And if you're coming up with questions together, please share them in the Google document that if Michelle or Melissa could drop that doc in the chat before people go. Let's do 10 minutes in breakout. So it'll be 3 or 4 folks, 10 minutes, just share with each other what you're reflecting on now. And if you want to write some questions out, we'll just pick like from a bouquet of flowers. We can't get to them all, but thank you everybody. So I think we'll go into the rooms. We'll see you back here.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, hey, sorry, I took a minute to unmute myself and figure out my tech. All right, is it just us?
Yeah, I think this, so did you get an invitation to a breakout room?
Hold on, I can hardly hear you. I might have to go inside. Can you say something again?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but it's super, super soft. I'm just gonna go, I'm outside, so that might be the reason why. Sorry about all this.
For sure.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay, sorry, what's your name?
My name's Michelle. I'm actually gonna go ahead and assign you to, this is actually just like our main room. I'm gonna assign you to a breakout room. Is that okay?
Yeah,
I think you might
sorry,
not
I
have
thought
gotten
we were
invitation.
in a breakout room.
No, it's all good. I'm gonna send you, you'll see a couple more folks in just a moment.
Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Right.
Is it cool if I share the flyer and some music?
Yeah, I think that's totally fine.
Okay.
I think these might just be some folks who didn't want to join the room.
Okay, cool.
Twilight.
Okay, welcome back. We're at least most of us, I think, are coming back now. So thank you for that experiment and collaboration. We appreciate everyone going into that moment of sharing. And I did see a question in the document that spoke to something, Fred, you were just sharing with us in our little small group about, can you say more about the captive maternal?
Well, what I feel like I ought to do is first of all, if you'll bear with me, if I can get my my chops, my Zoom chops. What I want to do is actually find the essay. I don't feel that it's right for me to do anything other than mention the concept and the idea that because I've become very invested in it and trying to understand it. But the full elaboration of it has to be through the work of Joy James herself, right? So, and I'm talking about not some private communication, but just a text that I read kind of after having seen maybe a film or a video of her giving a talk. So I feel less capable of, I don't want to explicate it more beyond what I already said. But what I do want to do is point you to an essay of hers called "The Womb of Western Theory: Trauma, Time, Theft, and the Captive Maternal." Okay. And if you let me, I think I can do this. I'll try to actually upload it into the chat, if that's okay. Can I do that? Okay.
Please.
So I'll stop talking now and just do that, and y'all keep going. So it'll be in there in a minute. So.
Okay, and I think we'll close with one last question. Let's see, I'm pulling it up right here. Okay, so What does collaborative practice look like in terms of scale and access in concrete terms for revolutionary aims? What would be the relation of these ideas to the entity of the Revolutionary Party?
Well, that's a great question. And, we didn't mention this as much, but of course, we're deeply influenced by more orthodox histories of revolution too. In my case, the Grenada Revolution in the Caribbean, affected my thinking a lot. But we're well aware of the revolutionary tradition in that we were speaking of which we could have spoken about, excuse me, when we were talking about these other kinds of post-colonial regimes, which went through these sort of colonial administrated independences. And of course, we know that those revolutionary movements are not without their moments of betrayal either. But I think, it also goes back to a persistent problem that we've tried to address around this sort of fallacious notion of scale and of scaling up, right? Which really needs to be reversed. Most of what we think of as scaling up is essentially scaling back, and you could take this all the way philosophically, you could just take it all the way right back to Marx, and the way he understands the abstract and the concrete, right? The more abstract you get, the more you scale up from the concrete, the more you lose, and you don't just lose it, in terms of richness of the general antagonism. You lose it in the sense that you enter into these forms of isolation. So if I could maybe answer the question with reference to Walter Rodney, I think when Rodney is talking about grounding, Rodney is talking about trying to dwell in the concrete differences that make up the different kinds of experiments that we're interested in, and that erupt, in all kinds of ways. So when in Groundings with My Brothers, Walter Rodney, is talking about sitting with Rastas and allowing them to teach him about their constantly emergent practices, their inventions, as they live them day by day. And this is what he keeps saying. He's saying, look, you should see how healthy these people are, what they're eating. You should see how they gather. He's talking about these very concrete practices. And, that's the source for us. That's the return to the source. And the further one gets from that, through revolutionary parties that appoint themselves on behalf of people, through political systems like the US, representative systems like the US, et cetera. The further you get from the source, the further you get from your strength. And, at the same time, of course, that source, that grounding is eruptive. It can throw you out and back and into confusion. It's not a place of utopia. It's the general antagonism, and all kinds of things erupt, because another way to think of Blackness is as this eruption into what is supposedly, regular life. Even in a place as lost as ours, the United States, even in a system as hopeless as ours, the other day, probably a lot of you saw Cori Bush give a talk. It was just, that you have to have a hard heart not to cry when she gave that speech, right? So, you know, there is these eruptions all the time that remind you of the groundings, you know, that are there. If we'll stay there and feel the richness of what we can share together, if we avoid this worlding. And that's all. I'll finish here with what I have to say about it. You know, that's all we're trying to say about study. You know, study is that place where you get together in order to help each other fall apart into this general antagonism, to help each other, you know, lose that individuation and find the sharedness that is the basis of our non-metaphysical being, let's say, or anti-metaphysical being. And it's just a practice that we do and think about in our way, but it's, you know, it's nothing original. That's what groundings was. That's what the red thread work is that Andaya does in Guyana amongst women. So, so scaling up, you know, it's tempting, but it's the same temptation as electoral politics or the revolutionary cadre or anything else, you know. And it's the place where we see betrayal play itself out. You know, Bernard Cord, Phyllis Cord in the Grenadier Revolution, they thought that they knew that they needed to represent at scale the Grenadian people, and they murdered, you know, Jacqueline Kraft and Maurice Bishop, you know, on the basis of that belief. That's the betrayal. And that betrayal, as we said, that's a systemic betrayal if you allow yourself to come into that kind of representation. And that's why we try as much as we can through study with everybody not to come into that, not to appear like that. You know, our concepts, you know, don't rise to the level of any kind of rigor, but that doesn't mean that they, you know, that they're nothing, you know. Yeah, thanks.
This is excellent. I want to ask maybe just a final question from the chat, or not from the chat, from the shared document that somebody placed in there about what about the end of the world that has happened over and over for Indigenous people? If y'all would want to say anything about that.
Well, I mean, it I think it might be, I don't know enough to answer that question, but I do know a little bit enough to know something about what else I would have to know to be able to address it. And it would have to be about, you know, we'd have to, as Stefano was saying, maybe scale it down and talk about what, not just which indigenous peoples we're talking about and what their conceptions of world were and what happened to bring those conceptions of world to an end. Because world is a concept. So it would have to be, you have to maybe ask the question that way. Or on the other hand, you might begin to address it by thinking through the relationship between indigeneity and earth. You know, what if that's kind of the way I would want to, you know, I think that's the way that we've been trying to begin to think through those questions. Look, in other words, what that would mean would be, partly what that would mean would be this, that as brutal and as apocalyptic as the phrase end of the world seems to be, and as final and as violent as that phrase seems to be, when we apply it to what has happened to indigenous peoples in this hemisphere, let's say, but not just this hemisphere, it's not even close to being either an accurate or an adequate account of what was actually done to and taken from indigenous peoples. Like what was actually done and what was actually taken is not approached by the phrase or by the notion end of the world. What comes closer to approximating or to describing what was done to and taken to indigenous people is entrance into the world, forced entrance into the world, forced displacement by the world, okay? Forced brutalization at the advent of world, right? As a function of the prosecution of globality, okay? As a conceptual framework and as a political economic force. Okay? So part of what's at stake is, now, are there indigenous conceptions of world that are different than the European model of world? Can we actually properly discuss European structures and ideas of world in a way that does not also allow them to take on the honorific of indigenous? These are fucked up questions, you know, that require a lot of common work. Okay. But what I would want to suggest, you know, what we're trying to say, you know, is that we simply refuse to presuppose the goodness of world. And we also simply refuse to presuppose the naturalness of world. Okay. That means we're more inclined to think about the beginning of the world, okay, in its alignment with brutality, than we are inclined to think about the end of the world in its alignment with brutality. But you know, that's a formulation which I don't feel so great or confident about, you know, and it's a formulation that has to be refined by way of study and by way of an immersion, a fuller immersion than we have been able to begin so far, but that we have hopes of engaging in soon, that would maybe give us another way of understanding, let's say, non-European conceptions of world. So.
This is a brilliant posing of a question rather than an answer, I think, and I'm so thankful for this conversation. I think we should close it now as we've gone a little bit over. So I want to just, with so much gratitude, thank you, Fred, and thank you, Stefano, for the work that you are doing and the way that you continue to share it with all of us. It's been this incredible pleasure and honor to study this work in preparation for this event and to be here and sharing this time and space with y'all. So I just want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I also want to thank everybody for the time you spent together, also posing some questions rather than, you know, positing answers. Sometimes that's what we can do. And I see so many thank yous coming through the chat, so that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing, everybody. I want to mention a couple things. Just thank you to everybody who's been helping with Oakland Summer School, helping make these events happen. There are a lot more coming. So you can check the website, which is oaklandsummerschool.org. And there's even a talk today with Keith McHenry from Food Not Bombs. So just, you know, keep your eyes open on that. Akande is doing a talk later in the month that I'm very much looking forward to, that I think we'll talk about some of the questions that have been raised today. So I'll pass it to you, Akande, to say any last words and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much again, Stefano and Fred. It was an absolute honor to be able to speak with you both. I've been researching and studying your work for years now, so it's surreal to be able to speak to you both. And yeah, I want to thank again, everyone at the Open Summer School, all the volunteers that have been helping us out in creating these incredible discussions and events. I want to give a special shout out to Michelle, who's I think Oakland Summer School is the name, but her name's Michelle, and she's been helping us out so much. And Danielle and Scott and Laura Nelson. I think, I'm not sure where she's calling in from, but yeah, thank you so much, because I feel like the roots of this event can be traced to Laura, and as well as Melissa and Grant, and yeah, I guess just the whole Oakland Summer School group. So and thank you all for being here and tuning in. It's an absolute honor again to be here right now with you all. So I think that's all I have to say.
Well,
So-
thank you, everyone. We had a great time, and we're only a Zoom away, so hopefully we'll get together again soon.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I just want to say one last thing, which is, I was just texting you. Well, anyway, we want to be able to. Anyway, it was a pleasure. We get a chance to talk with a lot of folks and meet a lot of people. And what I'm hoping we'll be able to do sometime very soon is a much better job at getting all the different people that we're able to meet together with amongst themselves, to hopefully be a kind of a conduit through which y'all can get together with some of these other folks that we're meeting. And the chance to meet with folks and talk with folks makes us always feel, like not just that good shit is around the corner, but that it's everywhere, So anyway, so thank you very much. We'll try to do a better job of sharing that with everybody. So.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you again. I think we're gonna have some music to tune for everyone to kind of trickle out with. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.